The pounding on my metal farm gate tore me out of sleep before the sun even thought about rising. At first I thought it was thunder, but thunder doesn't shout your name. Bright white headlights flooded my field, turning rows of young vegetables into long shadows that looked like prison bars. Two men in reflective vests stood at my fence like they owned the ground beneath my boots. One slapped a red stop work notice against the wire so hard it echoed across the soil I had spent months preparing. The other kept repeating the word fines like it was a weapon. My hands were shaking from the cold air and the smell of damp earth, but I refused to take the paper he tried to force into my grip. Then a black luxury SUV door opened and a sharply dressed woman stepped out, pointing at my crops and calling them an embarrassment to the community. In my head, I knew this land wasn't theirs, but in that moment, they acted like rulers and I was trespassing on my own property. When my workers arrived and were ordered to leave, fear turned into something hotter. This wasn't confusion. This was intimidation. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of something far worse. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? A few months earlier, none of this chaos existed. The land had been nothing more than a quiet stretch of open soil and sky, and to me it looked like a second chance written in green and brown instead of ink. I bought it just outside Briarwood Estates near Cedar Ridge County after years of bouncing between jobs that never lasted long enough to feel secure. Warehouses, delivery routes, night shifts in offices that smelled like stale coffee and printer toner. Every position promised stability and delivered uncertainty. I was tired of clocks that controlled my sleep and supervisors who changed every season. What I wanted was something that answered only to effort and patience. Farming was not glamorous, but it was honest. Seeds did not lie. Soil did not fire you. If you worked hard enough, something grew. The first morning I stood on that property alone, the silence felt enormous in the best possible way. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through apartment walls. Just wind brushing through tall grass and distant birds cutting across a pale sunrise. The soil was darker than I expected, rich and slightly damp beneath the surface, and when I knelt to run it through my fingers, it felt like holding possibility itself. I pictured rows of vegetables stretching in straight lines, irrigation tubes glistening under morning light, and small wooden crates filled with produce ready for local markets. It was not a dream of wealth. It was a dream of steadiness. I wanted income that came from effort instead of luck, a routine that started with daylight instead of alarms, and a future that did not depend on someone else's approval. I did everything carefully because I had no room for mistakes. County offices became familiar hallways. I checked zoning classifications, water usage regulations, and agricultural guidelines until clerks recognized my face before I spoke. Survey maps confirmed the boundaries clearly. The lines separating my land from Briarwood Estates stopped well short of my fence posts. There was no gray area, no technical loophole. The permits were approved one by one: fencing, irrigation, small utility sheds. Each stamped document felt like another brick in the foundation of my independence. I even hired a local surveyor to double-check the borders, watching him set bright markers in the soil that glowed under the afternoon sun like quiet assurances that I was safe from interference. When everything came back clean, relief settled into my chest in a way I had not felt in years. The early weeks were peaceful in a way that almost felt unreal. I woke before sunrise, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The air carried the scent of fresh soil and dew instead of exhaust fumes. I planted the first seedlings with careful hands, measuring spacing and watering schedules like they were sacred rituals. Neighbors driving past sometimes slowed down to watch, and a few even waved. A couple of older residents stopped to ask what I planned to grow, their curiosity friendly and unthreatening. Every small sign of progress. The first green sprouts breaking through the soil, the straight alignment of irrigation lines, the gentle hum of a rented tiller, built confidence. For the first time in a long while, my work felt meaningful instead of mechanical. My first encounter with the woman who would later stand at my gate came on a bright afternoon when the sky was so clear it almost looked painted. She introduced herself as Victoria Hale, president of the Briarwood Estates Homeowners Association. Her smile was polished, perfectly measured, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. She complimented the openness of the area, then quickly shifted to comments about maintaining community standards and protecting visual harmony. The words were pleasant on the surface but carried an edge underneath, like velvet stretched over steel. I explained calmly that my land was outside the HOA's jurisdiction and that I had county approval for everything. She nodded as if she understood, yet her gaze drifted across the young vegetable rows with visible disapproval. Before leaving, she mentioned how important image was to the neighborhood, the way someone might remind you to lower your voice in a library you never entered. It was polite, brief, and unsettling in a way I could not immediately explain. After that meeting, the atmosphere shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. A few neighbors who had once waved now offered tight smiles instead. One older man muttered something about HOA politics as he passed, shaking his head without stopping. The mornings were still quiet, the soil still fertile, but a faint tension crept into the edges of otherwise peaceful days. I told myself it was nothing, just overthinking born from years of instability. The permits were approved. The boundaries were clear. Facts were on my side. Yet every time I noticed a car slowing a little too long near the roadside, or a pair of distant figures pointing in my direction, a small knot formed in my stomach before I forced it away. Then one evening, after a long day installing additional irrigation lines, I opened my mailbox expecting nothing more than utility flyers or seed catalogs. Instead, a crisp white envelope sat alone inside, heavier than it looked. The return address carried the Briarwood Estates HOA letterhead, bold and official. For a moment I simply stared at it, confused by its presence. My land was not theirs. It never had been. The paper felt cold between my fingers as I slid it open under the fading light, and before I even finished the first paragraph, a quiet certainty settled over me that something was wrong, not a misunderstanding, not a clerical error, but the first deliberate step into a conflict I had never invited. The first real line was crossed on a morning that looked completely ordinary. The sky was pale blue, the air warm enough to promise a good day of work, and I was halfway through checking irrigation valves when I noticed a bright strip of paper fluttering against the wooden boundary post near the road. At first I thought it was an advertisement someone had stapled there by mistake, but as I walked closer, the bold red letters became impossible to ignore. Violation notice. The words were printed in a font designed to intimidate, surrounded by official-looking seals that meant nothing once you actually read them. It had been nailed directly into my post, splitting the wood slightly, like whoever put it there wanted the message to hurt physically as well as financially. My name was spelled correctly. My address was correct. Everything else was fiction. According to that paper, I was in breach of community agricultural restrictions and aesthetic preservation codes. None of those applied to me. They were HOA terms, and my property did not belong to that association. The notice demanded immediate cessation of all farm activity and listed a fine amount that increased daily. The numbers were absurd, but the presentation was convincing enough that someone who didn't know better might panic. I stood there for a long moment with the notice in my hand, feeling confusion twist into irritation. It was not just incorrect. It was deliberate. That same afternoon, 2 of my hired workers arrived to continue soil preparation, and I watched their confidence evaporate within minutes. A black sedan slowed near the entrance and a sharply dressed man stepped out, clipboard in hand, speaking in a tone that suggested authority he did not possess. He pointed at the crops, at the tools, at the workers themselves, warning them about legal repercussions. He never addressed me directly. Instead, he targeted the people I depended on, the ones who had no reason to stay if they believed trouble was coming. One of them quietly packed his equipment and left without finishing his shift. The other avoided eye contact for the rest of the day. Fear spreads quickly when it is dressed in official language. That evening, my inbox filled with emails from Victoria Hale. Each message was polished, formatted, and dripping with false confidence. She cited non-existent clauses, referenced community board decisions, and attached scanned copies of documents that looked legitimate until you compared them to actual county codes. Her tone never rose above professional courtesy, but every line carried a threat hidden behind polite phrasing. She wrote as if the outcome was already decided, as if resistance would only make things worse. I responded the only way I knew how, calmly, with facts. I attached my permits, boundary surveys, and county approvals. I highlighted the sections proving my land stood outside their jurisdiction. I expected a correction, or at least silence. Instead, the next email ignored every document I sent and repeated the same demands, as though reality itself was optional. It was around this time that Marcus Doyle walked over from the neighboring property one late afternoon. He was a retired surveyor with a slow, thoughtful way of speaking and a habit of carrying folded maps in his jacket pocket. He had been watching the situation from a distance, and when he saw the second notice taped to my fence, he shook his head with quiet disbelief. We stood by the boundary markers together while he explained in clear technical terms how the HOA limits ended well before my land began. He pointed to the exact coordinates, the elevation notes, the recorded plat lines filed years earlier. Listening to him was like stepping into solid ground after walking on shifting sand. The facts were not just on my side. They were carved into official records that could not be rewritten by opinion. But facts did not slow the letters. If anything, they multiplied. What began as a single notice became a steady stream of claims, each more absurd than the last. One accused me of unauthorized construction despite no structures being built. Another cited noise violations on days when the only sound had been wind through the crops. They stacked these accusations like bricks, hoping the weight alone would crush me even if each one was hollow. My disbelief gradually hardened into concern. This was no longer a misunderstanding or an overzealous board member protecting neighborhood aesthetics. It was a strategy built on volume and pressure. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon when I opened my mailbox and found not one envelope, but 5. Each carried the same HOA letterhead. Each claimed fines already accumulating, numbers rising by the day as if time itself were billing me. The total printed across the pages was so high it made my chest tighten for a second, not because it was valid, but because it revealed intent. They were not trying to correct anything. They were trying to bury me under paper and fear, to make the cost of resistance look greater than the cost of surrender. Standing there with those envelopes in my hands, I finally understood the real plan. This was financial suffocation disguised as enforcement, and they expected me to panic before I ever reached for the truth. The shift from paperwork to pressure happened so gradually that at first I kept telling myself it was coincidence. A delayed delivery here, a canceled appointment there, small inconveniences that felt irritating but explainable. Then the pattern became impossible to ignore. The seed supplier who had confirmed shipment days earlier suddenly stopped answering calls. A truck carrying irrigation tubing turned around before reaching the gate, the driver later admitting someone in a reflective vest had warned him the site was under investigation. Tools I had rented were flagged in the system as disputed orders. Each interruption cost time, and time on a farm is not measured in minutes, but in growth cycles you cannot rewind. The vegetables did not understand delays. They either received water and care, or they suffered quietly. The impersonation came on a gray afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy like it knew something I did not. A man arrived in a plain sedan with a laminated badge clipped to his belt and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He introduced himself as a county inspector with rehearsed authority, walking straight past me without waiting for permission. His questions were vague but delivered with confidence, and he spoke loudly enough for the remaining workers to hear every word. He mentioned violations that did not exist and consequences that sounded severe. When I asked for identification beyond the badge, he hesitated just long enough to expose the act. But hesitation was all it took. The workers saw uncertainty and chose safety. By evening, 2 more people declined future shifts. The field grew quieter, not because the work was done, but because fear had begun doing its own work. Online, the tone shifted from whispers to accusations. Community pages filled with posts describing my farm as an eyesore and a threat to property values. Photos were taken from angles that exaggerated shadows and clutter, captions written to stir outrage instead of truth. Strangers commented as if they had toured the land themselves. Some neighbors who once greeted me politely now avoided eye contact altogether, their silence louder than any insult. A woman who used to jog past my fence crossed the road before reaching my property, glancing back as if I had become something contagious. Isolation does not arrive all at once. It creeps in through small social fractures until you realize you are standing alone in spaces that once felt shared. Nights became the worst part. Sleep grew shallow, easily broken by distant sounds that might have been nothing or might have been something. One early morning I stepped outside and found a section of irrigation piping loosened, the water pooling uselessly into soil that needed precision, not flooding. Nothing was destroyed outright, but enough was disturbed to cost hours of repair. The message was subtle yet unmistakable. Progress would not come easily. I began checking locks twice, then 3 times, scanning the perimeter with a flashlight like a guard instead of a farmer. Fatigue settled into my shoulders and stayed there, turning simple decisions into exhausting calculations. Hoping to end the tension through conversation, I attended an HOA meeting despite knowing I had no obligation to be there. The room smelled of polished wood and coffee, a calm setting that disguised the hostility waiting beneath it. When I introduced myself, a few people exchanged knowing looks before I finished my first sentence. Victoria Hale listened with a smile that never softened, then invited others to share concerns. The comments that followed were less about regulations and more about perception, how my work changed the character of the area, how standards must be upheld. Laughter surfaced when someone suggested I should have chosen a more suitable hobby. I stood there with documents in my hand and facts on my side, yet the atmosphere treated reality like a nuisance rather than a foundation. It was not a debate. It was a performance, and I had been cast as the villain before I entered the room. When I finally contacted local authorities about the impersonator and the tampering, the response was polite but distant. Civil matter. That phrase carried the weight of dismissal wrapped in professionalism. Without clear footage or undeniable proof, there was little they could do. I understood their limitations, yet the result felt the same as being told to endure quietly. The system moved slowly, while intimidation moved quickly, and the gap between those speeds widened every day. Doubt began to appear in moments I had once filled with certainty. I caught myself calculating how much longer I could absorb delays, how much money I could lose before the dream became unsustainable. The field that once represented independence started to look like a battlefield measured in receipts and repair logs. Still, every time I considered stepping back, something inside resisted. I had done everything by the book. Walking away would not be surrendering a project, it would be surrendering principle. The final push of that phase arrived in a single envelope slipped into my mailbox with deliberate neatness. The paper inside was heavier than the others, stamped with legal terminology and phrasing designed to intimidate. It warned of eviction proceedings and immediate action, written as if authority had already been granted. I read it twice, then a third time, searching for jurisdiction that did not exist. The language was convincing, the formatting flawless, but the foundation was empty. They had no right to evict me from land they did not control. Standing there with that document in my hand, I felt cornered in a way that tightened my chest, yet beneath the pressure a steadier realization formed. They could surround me with threats, but they could not change the truth. I was shaken, exhausted, and pushed further than I had ever expected, but I was not broken. The night I opened that eviction letter, something inside me stopped bending. For weeks I had reacted, defended, explained, and absorbed every new threat like it was weather I could not control. But sitting at my small kitchen table with that thick paper under the dim yellow light, I realized something that changed the direction of everything. I had not been helpless. I had been patient. And patience, when paired with proof, was not weakness. It was leverage. What they did not know was that I had been documenting every single interaction since the first red notice appeared on my fence. At the time, it had felt like a precaution, almost unnecessary. I kept my phone in my pocket during confrontations, camera ready. I saved every email, every envelope, every message that arrived with their polished letterhead and hollow authority. I photographed the false notices nailed to my posts, captured timestamps, and stored copies in folders labeled by date and sender. What started as cautious record-keeping slowly became a detailed archive of their overreach. I had not raised my voice because I had been building something stronger than an argument. I had been building a timeline. Marcus Doyle became more than just a neighbor during that period. He brought over rolled maps one afternoon, spreading them across the hood of his old pickup truck, like a general planning a campaign. His hands moved with quiet certainty as he pointed to coordinates, boundary lines, and recorded plat numbers filed years earlier. He explained how jurisdiction limits were defined, not by opinions or aesthetics, but by survey stakes hammered into the ground long before either of us bought our properties. Listening to him was like turning on a light in a room I did not realize had been dim. The facts were not scattered pieces anymore. They were a structure. Together, we organized copies of official records, printed enlarged boundary maps, and highlighted the sections that left no room for interpretation. Each document added weight to the truth, until it felt solid enough to stand on. Olivia Grant entered the picture through the local farmers market, a place that had always been more about community than commerce. She was a paralegal by profession and an organizer by instinct, the kind of person who listened carefully before speaking. When I explained what had been happening, she did not react with shock or outrage. She reacted with focus. She talked about documentation the way mechanics talk about tools, precise, necessary, and effective when used correctly. She helped me refine my records, showing me how to arrange evidence so that it told a clear story instead of existing as scattered fragments. Emails were sorted into chronological chains. Photos were labeled with dates and locations. She explained the power of consistency, how calm organization often defeated loud intimidation. For the first time since the harassment began, I felt like I was not just defending myself but preparing to present the truth in a language authority could not ignore. The discovery that shifted my mindset completely came by accident. One evening, while reviewing footage from a small camera I had installed near the entrance, I paused on the frame showing the man who had impersonated the county inspector. His car sat partially visible behind him, just enough of the license plate exposed to be legible when I zoomed in. The numbers were clear. Curiosity turned into verification, and verification turned into revelation. Marcus recognized the vehicle description almost immediately. It belonged to a member of the HOA board, someone who had publicly denied any involvement in enforcement actions. That single connection snapped weeks of uncertainty into a straight line. This was not random harassment. It was coordinated. Fear does not disappear all at once. It changes shape. Mine transformed into determination the moment the pieces aligned. Every letter, every fake notice, every blocked delivery was no longer an isolated irritation. It was evidence of intent. The pressure that had once made my chest tighten now sharpened my focus. I started waking before sunrise again, not from anxiety but from purpose. The same soil that had once symbolized peace now symbolized ground worth defending. Conversations with Marcus became strategic rather than reactive. Meetings with Olivia felt like rehearsals for clarity rather than complaints about unfairness. I realized something else during those days. Intimidation relies on silence. It depends on people feeling too overwhelmed or uncertain to respond with structure. The moment structure appears, intimidation loses its grip. My records were no longer private precautions. They were shields and, if necessary, mirrors that could reflect every tactic back to its source. I no longer wondered whether I could withstand the pressure. I began wondering how long they could. By the time the next threatening email arrived, my reaction was different. Instead of frustration, I felt calm. Instead of doubt, I felt preparation. They believed they were tightening control, but in reality, they were leaving fingerprints on every surface they touched. Each step they took without authority strengthened my position with authority. The imbalance that once leaned against me had quietly shifted. Standing in the field one evening, watching the last light stretch across the young crops, I understood the situation with a clarity I had not possessed before. They had mistaken patience for weakness and legality for vulnerability. They thought pressure would push me out. What they had actually done was give me time to gather proof, allies, and confidence. The conflict was no longer about vegetables or appearances. It was about jurisdiction, truth, and the refusal to be bullied off land I had every right to cultivate. In that moment, the fear that had shadowed me for weeks dissolved into something steadier. They had started a war with paperwork and intimidation. I was going to finish it with facts and law. They had chosen the battlefield, but they had chosen the wrong opponent because they had started a war they legally could not win. The moment I shifted from reacting to planning, the entire rhythm of my days changed. I was no longer waking up wondering what they might do next. I was waking up asking how I would document it when they did. The farm still demanded attention, watering schedules, soil checks, crop rotations. But alongside those routines grew another system, quieter and far more deliberate. I installed security cameras at the entrance, along the fence line, and near the equipment shed, choosing angles that captured both the road and the boundary markers. They were small, almost invisible, unless you knew where to look, and that invisibility became my first advantage. The first time I reviewed the footage and saw clear timestamps attached to every movement near my property, a steady confidence replaced the helplessness that had haunted earlier weeks. For the first time, I felt like the land itself had begun to watch with me. Documentation became its own discipline. I created digital folders labeled by date, then subdivided them into emails, photographs, video clips, and letters. Every threatening message from the HOA was archived instead of deleted. Every fake notice was photographed before being removed, the nail holes and torn paper edges preserved as visual proof. I stopped treating these incidents as annoyances and started treating them as entries in a record that told a clear, chronological story. The act of organizing transformed chaos into something structured. Each piece of evidence was small on its own, but together they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. Marcus Doyle proved invaluable during this phase. One afternoon, he arrived with a weathered folder filled with county archive copies he had requested through official channels. Inside were historical boundary maps dating back decades, complete with surveyor stamps and reference numbers that connected directly to current records. We spread them across a makeshift table in my shed, tracing the lines that defined jurisdiction with careful fingers. Those maps showed, beyond any argument, that the HOA's authority stopped well before my fence. Seeing those boundaries drawn repeatedly across time was like hearing the same truth echoed from different years. It was not just my word against theirs. It was public record standing beside me, silent but undeniable. Olivia Grant approached the situation with the calm precision of someone accustomed to untangling legal knots. She drafted formal cease and desist letters that carried a tone of professionalism impossible to dismiss as emotional reaction. The language was firm but measured, outlining specific instances of harassment and clearly citing the limits of their authority. Sending those letters did more than communicate boundaries. It shifted the narrative from personal dispute to documented overreach. Each envelope that left my mailbox felt less like a plea and more like a marker placed on a timeline that was becoming increasingly difficult for them to ignore. Olivia also encouraged me to gather witness statements, not dramatic testimonies but straightforward accounts from delivery drivers, workers, and nearby residents who had seen intimidation firsthand. Those statements added voices to what had previously been a solitary defense. Despite these quiet victories, the HOA continued its tactics as if unaware they were reinforcing the very case that would stand against them. More emails arrived, more notices appeared, and more comments surfaced online, attempting to shape perception rather than reflect reality. The difference now was that none of it caught me off guard. Instead of anxiety, I felt a cautious optimism that came from preparation. Each new act of interference was not a setback, but an addition to the archive. Their persistence, once exhausting, began to reveal its own weakness. Intimidation thrives on unpredictability, and predictability had become their habit. There were moments when I sensed a larger move forming behind the scenes. Conversations among neighbors shifted in tone, and vehicles unfamiliar to the area began appearing more frequently near the entrance. The harassment no longer felt random or impulsive, it felt coordinated, as if they were building toward a single decisive action meant to overwhelm everything that came before it. Instead of worrying about what that action might be, I focused on ensuring that whatever form it took would land against a wall of preparation. Cameras remained active, records updated daily, and every interaction logged with date and time. The routine of vigilance replaced the earlier routine of worry. Small confirmations reinforced the strategy. A delivery driver who had once been turned away returned with a signed statement describing the encounter in detail. A camera captured clear footage of a late-night vehicle slowing near the boundary markers without crossing them. Emails began contradicting each other, revealing inconsistencies in their claims. None of these moments alone ended the conflict, but each one added another thread to a tapestry that was becoming impossible to unravel. Progress was no longer measured solely by crop growth, but by the strengthening of a case that was taking shape quietly and methodically. Then, as if on cue, the next development arrived not as a whisper, but as an announcement. A formal message circulated through community channels declaring an emergency board meeting scheduled to resolve violations permanently. The wording was deliberate, designed to sound final and authoritative. Reading it, I felt neither panic nor anger. Instead, I recognized it as the culmination of everything that had been building, their attempt at a decisive strike. By the time that notice appeared, my documentation was complete, my evidence organized, and my allies informed. I closed the final folder on my computer, printed the necessary copies, and placed them neatly into a binder that held weeks of careful preparation. They believed they were preparing to end the matter. In reality, I had just finished assembling the package that would ensure it ended very differently than they expected. The parking lot outside the community hall was already half full when I arrived, headlights cutting across the building's pale brick walls like restless searchbeams. I sat in my truck for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the steady weight of the evidence folder resting on the passenger seat. It was thicker than any document I had ever carried, not because of the paper itself, but because of what it represented. Weeks of sleepless nights, organized proof, and quiet preparation. The air outside felt colder than it should have for that time of year, or maybe it was just the anticipation tightening my chest. I picked up the folder, felt its solid edge press against my palm, and stepped out into a silence broken only by distant murmurs drifting from the hall's entrance. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with low conversation that stopped just a fraction of a second too late when I walked in. Folding chairs lined the room in uneven rows, most of them already occupied. Some faces held curiosity, others discomfort, and a few unmistakable expressions of quiet hostility. At the front sat the HOA board behind a long table draped in a neat cloth, name placards arranged with deliberate symmetry. Victoria Hale occupied the center seat, posture straight, smile controlled, her hands folded as if the outcome of the night had already been decided hours earlier. The confidence she carried was not loud, but it was unmistakable. The kind that comes from believing the stage belongs to you. I chose a seat near the aisle, placing the evidence folder on my lap, its presence grounding me more than any reassuring word could have. My fingers rested lightly on its cover, tracing the edge of the binder ring without looking down. Across the room, Marcus Doyle sat near the back, blending into the crowd with the quiet composure that had always defined him. He did not wave or nod, but our eyes met for a brief second that carried a shared understanding. Outside, just beyond the glass doors, Olivia Grant waited with additional copies neatly stacked in her arms, ready but unseen. Knowing she was there steadied the rhythm of my breathing. This was no longer a solitary appearance. It was a coordinated presence. The meeting opened with procedural formalities that sounded routine, but carried an undercurrent of performance. Victoria's voice flowed smoothly through introductions, community updates, and reminders of standards and values. The words were carefully chosen, neutral on the surface, yet edged with implication. Then the conversation shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward the subject everyone had come to hear. My name surfaced in a sentence framed as concern rather than accusation, but the direction was clear. She spoke about property values, about the importance of maintaining visual harmony, about unregulated developments, threatening the character of the neighborhood. Each phrase landed with the weight of a verdict disguised as dialogue. Heads nodded in scattered agreement. Murmurs rippled across the chairs like wind moving through tall grass. When she finally addressed me directly, the room tightened. Her tone remained polite, her posture composed, but the accusation was unmistakable. She described my farm as a risk, an influence that could diminish appeal and lower standards. The words were measured, but they carried the intent of condemnation. I listened without interrupting, my hand still resting on the folder, my expression neutral despite the heat rising behind my ribs. Remaining calm was not an act of submission, It was a deliberate choice. The tension in the room grew heavier with each sentence she spoke, not because I responded, but because I did not. Silence, in that moment, carried more weight than rebuttal. Residents began whispering among themselves, some leaning closer to hear better, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A man near the front crossed his arms with visible certainty, while a woman beside him avoided looking at me altogether. The atmosphere felt electrically charged, like the seconds before a storm breaks open. Victoria continued, building her argument with the confidence of someone who believed momentum alone could define truth. She referenced complaints, cited unnamed sources, and painted a picture of disruption without acknowledging the boundaries that separated jurisdiction from preference. Each statement sounded polished, rehearsed, and incomplete. My gaze drifted briefly toward the glass doors where Olivia's silhouette stood still, her presence a quiet reassurance that preparation extended beyond the room's walls. Marcus shifted slightly in his chair at the back, the faint creak of metal legs against the floor echoing louder than it should have. The evidence folder on my lap felt heavier now, not with doubt, but with timing. Every page inside it was a counterweight waiting for the precise moment to tip the balance. Victoria concluded her remarks with a call for action framed as necessity rather than choice. The board members exchanged brief nods, their confidence synchronized. A motion was proposed, phrased in formal language that carried the promise of legal pursuit and enforcement. The air seemed to thin as hands hovered above notepads and microphones. Conversations faded into an anticipatory hush. It was the kind of silence that exists only when everyone expects a decision to fall like a gavel. She lifted her chin slightly, scanning the room with an expression that suggested closure rather than discussion. Her voice rose just enough to command attention as she prepared to initiate the vote that could bury my farm under the illusion of authority. In that suspended second, the murmurs disappeared entirely, replaced by a stillness so complete I could hear the faint hum of overhead lights. I tightened my grip on the folder, feeling the solid edges align beneath my fingers, and slowly pushed my chair back. As Victoria opened her mouth to finalize the motion, I stood up. Not in defiance, not in anger, but in readiness, carrying weeks of proof in my hands and every intention of revealing it. The moment I stood, the room shifted from anticipation to confusion. Chairs creaked as people turned, and the quiet that had settled like a blanket suddenly felt fragile, ready to tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I simply opened the evidence folder and let the first document slide onto the table in front of the board. A survey map, enlarged and highlighted, its boundary lines thick and unmistakable. The room leaned forward almost collectively, curiosity replacing certainty. Victoria's expression held for a second longer than it should have, then tightened at the corners. I spoke calmly, each word measured, not to persuade, but to present. Permits came next. Official county stamps visible even from the second row. Irrigation approvals. Land use confirmations. Utility permissions. Paper after paper laid down like stepping stones leading away from accusation and toward fact. The murmurs returned, but they sounded different now, less like agreement and more like realization. I could see residents comparing the documents to the claims they had heard minutes earlier. Truth did not need volume. It needed clarity. The glass doors opened softly, and Olivia stepped in without interrupting, moving along the aisle with quiet efficiency. She placed copies into waiting hands. Residents, board members, anyone willing to accept them. The rustle of papers spread across the room like a new language being learned simultaneously. I watched faces shift as they read, eyebrows lifting, lips tightening, eyes moving faster line by line. The narrative Victoria had built so carefully began to unravel without a single raised voice. Marcus rose from the back with the same steady composure he had always carried. He did not hurry. He walked to the front and laid historical boundary maps beside the modern survey, aligning them so the coordinates matched perfectly. He spoke in precise technical terms, pointing to recorded plat numbers, dates filed decades earlier, and markers that had never moved. His explanation was not emotional or argumentative. It was factual, methodical, and impossible to refute. The maps showed the same truth across different years, like echoes confirming one another. Residents leaned closer, some standing to see better, The room no longer felt like a courtroom stacked against me. It felt like a classroom discovering a mistake that could no longer be ignored. Then I played the recordings. Short clips, clear audio, timestamps visible. The impersonator's voice instructing workers to leave. The fabricated authority. The license plate frame paused on the screen long enough for recognition to ripple through the chairs. Gasps surfaced, sharp and involuntary. I did not accuse anyone by name. I let the evidence introduce itself. Victoria's posture changed almost imperceptibly at first, shoulders drawing in, chin lowering by a fraction. Confidence drains quietly before it disappears completely. The final shift came when the side door opened and a county official stepped in, uniform neat, demeanor neutral. He did not hurry to the front. He simply presented his identification and spoke in the same calm tone I had used all evening. His confirmation was brief and unambiguous. The property in question lay outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The boundaries were clear. The association held no enforcement authority there. The words were not dramatic, but they carried the weight of institutional clarity. The board members exchanged glances that no longer matched their earlier certainty. Moments later, the presence of police officers near the entrance added a quiet finality to the atmosphere. They did not storm the room or issue commands. They stood, observant and professional, their mere presence turning speculation into accountability. The board members who had spoken with such assurance minutes earlier now shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. The balance of power did not tip loudly. It inverted with a soft, undeniable certainty. Residents who had murmured in agreement before now whispered in disbelief. Some looked toward me with apologies they had not yet voiced. Others turned toward the board with expressions of disappointment that cut deeper than anger. Public perception, once shaped by confident claims, now reshaped itself around visible proof. Victoria's polished smile was gone, replaced by the tight composure of someone realizing the stage had never truly belonged to her. Authority built on assumption dissolved under the steady light of documentation. I closed the folder slowly, not as a gesture of triumph, but of completion. There was nothing left to add. The evidence had spoken in its own language, and the room understood it fluently. The vote that had been moments away lost its meaning before it could be called. Conversations shifted from enforcement to consequences, from accusations to accountability. The structure that had supported intimidation cracked, not with noise, but with clarity. Walking toward the exit, I felt the air change from tense to relieved, as if the room itself had exhaled. Outside, the night felt wider, the sky clearer than when I had arrived. Behind me, the murmurs continued, but they no longer carried the weight of threat. They carried the tone of reckoning. The power the HOA had wielded so confidently did not fade. It shattered, scattering into the silence left by truth. And in that silence, the inevitability of consequences settled with the same certainty as sunrise. The weeks that followed did not explode with drama the way the confrontation had. Instead, everything unfolded with a steady inevitability that felt almost peaceful. The court proceedings were direct and unemotional, built entirely on the same documents that had shifted the balance in that meeting room. Fines were issued, not symbolic but substantial enough to leave a mark. The association that once sent threatening letters now received official notices stamped with authority it could not argue against. Victoria Hale was removed from her position quietly, without speeches or ceremony, her name disappearing from newsletters and announcements as if it had been written in erasable ink. The power that once felt overwhelming dissolved into procedure and consequence, replaced by something far less dramatic but far more permanent: accountability. What surprised me most was not the legal outcome, but the change in the people around me. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact began stopping by the fence with hesitant smiles and simple apologies. Some brought small gestures: a bag of seeds, a cup of coffee, a few minutes of conversation that carried more sincerity than any formal statement ever could. The same community that had whispered uncertainty now spoke with openness, and the shift felt genuine rather than forced. Local markets reached out, interested not only in the produce but in the story behind it. Fresh vegetables that once struggled to reach buyers now sold out before midday, crates emptying as quickly as they were filled. The farm became known less as a controversy and more as a place of honest work, and the soil responded the only way it ever had, by growing. My mornings returned to what they were meant to be. I woke before sunrise again, not from anxiety but from routine. The air carried the scent of dew and earth instead of tension. Rows of green stretched across the field with quiet confidence, irrigation lines glistening under soft light. Harvest days felt purposeful rather than pressured, each basket filled with proof that patience produces results more reliably than fear ever could. The chaos that once defined the entrance to my property faded into memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of planting, tending, and gathering. Where headlights and raised voices once dominated the dawn, there was now only the sound of wind moving through leaves. Looking back, the conflict was never truly about vegetables or appearances. It was about dignity, the right to stand on lawful ground without being pushed off by louder voices. Patience had not meant inaction, it had meant preparation. Documentation had not been paranoia, it had been clarity. The truth did not shout or demand attention. It waited, recorded, and revealed itself when the moment required it. Ego and control had tried to define the narrative, but persistence rooted in fact outlasted both. The lesson was not that confrontation is always necessary, but that surrendering to intimidation is never the answer when the law stands firmly beside you. Now, when I walk the perimeter at sunrise, the quiet feels earned rather than borrowed. The land is still the same stretch of soil and sky I first fell in love with, but my understanding of it has deepened. It is not quiet because someone permitted it to be. It is quiet because truth held its ground. My land is quiet again, not because they allowed it, but because the law protected it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?